Um, all right. And I've hit record already. We'll go ahead and get started. Like I said, it's just going to be a small meeting this time. Oh, dang, it doesn't let me. That's fine. So this is our third conversation. First, I'm going to mute y'all. All right, bye. Um, this is our third meeting. The first one was kind of an overview. The second one was hate crimes, where we got some good things going on. I got a call from Tim earlier, Eric. And this one is going to be on employment and employment discrimination, how it intersects with military folks. So just like last time, we'll do 20 minutes, 20 minutes, 20 minutes. There's not very many of us, so leave lots of time for discussion. Um, but the bulk of it, I'm going to be talking about VEVRA. USERRA is actually a pretty good law, seems to work. Doesn't protect veterans, it protects service members, anybody with an active contract. And I'm going to talk about some of the examples or evidence of how we can see when things aren't quite working. And so I said rampant discrimination, but I don't know. Is the first word that came to mind. And then we'll talk. We'll have our discussion at the end. Um, so the close this out. I cannot. Introductions. Tim, I don't remember if you were there, but Eric and Tim, if you'd let me know if you've had any experience or anecdotal interactions around employment discrimination, harassment, or bias, and then I'll kind of close us out with my own experience, and we'll get started.
Um, from the standpoint of a caseworker, I have handled cases that have dealt with that, where a person that worked for an agency was not receiving the benefits that they were supposed to based off being, or the consideration they were supposed to get based off of being a veteran. Um, in that regard, it was um, you're supposed to get a special consideration being a veteran, and he wasn't getting that special consideration. Um, then there was another one where uh, he was being placed because of he was a veteran. Based off being a veteran, he had a specific kind of disability, and they were putting him into a role based off of not considering his disability with the hopes that they could fire him later, and which can't happen. That was totally, they weren't supposed to be doing that. So I've had those are two that come to mind. But if I went through, I've probably had 5 or 6 cases of that nature.
Hmm. Tim, you have any input or thoughts or
Well, mine's a little older. I served from 84 to 87. We were still in the shadow of Vietnam. I was an Army medic, and when I came back here, I also got my Maryland State EMT. I was stationed at Fort Meade, Maryland. I worked on the post ambulance for Fort Meade, Maryland. I came out with a letter of recommendation, etc. And like here in California, of course, there's no reciprocity at that time. What I ran into was just a lot of, we don't care about your military experience. We don't care that you were in the Army. We don't, just a whole bunch of that. And again, this was still, we were in, like I say, the shadow of Vietnam. Um, Things didn't start changing until Desert Shield, Desert Storm. And then, of course, with 9/11, it blew up. But yeah, there were things like that. It wasn't unusual, shall I say.
okay. Nick, I see you just joined us. We're just talking about any experiences we've had as veterans or experiences we've heard of that that might give us some insight into employment discrimination or bias. Did you have anything you wanted to contribute? I see that you're muted though.
Hello. Um, just checking in at the moment. don't have anything to say at the moment, but just checking in.
Okay, awesome. Thanks, Nick. Um, as promised, so this is what set it off for me is employment discrimination. Just as quickly as I can make it, I was on track to be an academic. I just wanted to teach at some sleepy college town and read books and think about God. And uh, I had my first master's degree from Duke. It was a really interesting experience. I went there wanting to study something, and I didn't get the chance to because there was a clear need to be thinking about something else. And I was constantly being sought out for advice by chaired faculty members about how to understand and interact with veterans because I was older than most of the students and I'd kind of been through the ringer. I got a second degree and came back and I got a TA contract. And I mean, it's an at-will state. It's, that's all fine and dandy. But I had several years of teaching experience before I began working at Duke as an employee. And something clicked for me when I found out I was going to become a dad. And a lot of the like thousand tiny paper cuts, I'm sure most of y'all can kind of uh, can affirm, like you can take it. Like that's what I was trained to do. Uh, when my back first went out when I was 31, my now wife had to like tell me, Logan, this isn't normal. Let's go to the emergency room. So we went to the VA and she saw how much it sucked. And then she was like, oh, I thought you were always just overplaying how bad it is. I'm like, no, that it really sucks. But when I found out I'd become a father, it wasn't just another consenting adult that I had responsibilities for. It was a, a soon to be born child. So how it played out for me was I got this weird TA section. I was given an evening section, which we never had before at Duke, and I was given half the number of students as all the other preceptors. And some of the other TAs, we call them preceptors, some of them had two sections. So it made sense to me, like why wouldn't you just make sure all the sections have equal numbers? And then I thought, well, nobody wants to work at night. And so I asked my students, like, on the first day of class, I'm like, what appeals to you for night class? And most of them said, I didn't choose this. They just put me here. So that was all fine. But then I found out I was going to be a dad, and the timing of the section was at when I would be doing bedtime. And so I didn't want to talk to the person who hired me because she had a history with my wife, and I just didn't like her either. I just didn't trust her. And so I did what I thought I was supposed to do. You find the EEOC representative, that was the divinity dean at the time. So I set up a meeting with the divinity school dean uh, just to say, look, I want to keep working here, but I can't work an evening section. And the person who hired me, we have a history of, and I don't think she would treat me fairly. So I had this meeting. Then I got an email saying, hey, everybody's got to do this implicit bias training. It happened to be on the same day I was supposed to meet with my dean, February 29th, 2016. And so I go to this implicit bias training in my mind, knowing I'm about to talk to the dean about like, how do I keep working here without, getting replaced as a squeaky wheel? And it was in that implicit bias training where I realized all the stuff that I just kind of was shrugging off as a student and was seeing as an employee as well, that the name for that, or I was just kind of shrugging it off because it just must suck to be a veteran. Like I get it. And I realized like, no, that's not supposed to be how it works. This is what anti-bias stuff is for, so that you're not looked at in class as though you've got, as one veteran told me, he said, sometimes the other students look at me like I've got stupid stamped across my forehead. And all they know about me is that I had served and I deployed. So um, I met with my dean. It was a really good conversation and it's very kind of candid and upfront. I had no reason to be like angry. It's just like, I need to take my career path seriously because I have no mentors. there were no military veterans on faculty at Duke at my school. I had nobody who was walking me through how to be a seminarian or a religion scholar. And I had somebody who had control over my job that I didn't trust and could use my military service as an excuse to take away a contract. So the dean encouraged me to talk to another vet, the only vet she knew at the divinity school, who happened to be a fundraiser and who had been a commander in the Navy. I don't know how high he was. I think it was like an 06. And this other vet, as a fundraiser, you know, you got to make people happy. You always got a smile on your face. And I told him all this stuff that had gone on when I was a student, including learning that a student veteran had taken their own life 2 years before I had gotten there, and what Duke senior vice presidents were saying they were going to do to change orientation and change the culture at Duke because of this suicide. By the time I'd gotten there in 2010, still didn't happen. And the veteran, this guy, it was not his experience. He had a really good experience at Duke. He loved his job. He loved his peers. He also wasn't enlisted, and he wasn't a combat MOS. So there were these tiny little distinctions that I began seeing as like, oh, these are bigger than I realized. And at the end of our meeting, I had this kind of litany of things that I and other veterans had brought up when I was a student and the president of the SVA chapter at Duke. And at the end of the meeting, I said, you know, I just want to help. I want this place to be a better place for other veterans. I'm already working here, and he said something to which my response was like, I'm tired and angry. And he didn't, and I said something like, you know, if after hearing all this stuff, you aren't angry too, like, I don't know what we're going to do because nothing's going to change. And so he then tried to take stuff into his own hands. And things just kind of fell apart. The person who hired me found out I was asking questions. I didn't get offered a second contract. I blew the whistle, the wagon circled, and inside 6 months, I started 2 federal investigations at Duke. And I'd been told by one of my faculty mentors, you'll be blacklisted if you pursue this. And sure enough, I was a stay-at-home dad for the next 8 years. So this is really close to my experience. It's very complicated. Another veteran in California who's a practicing attorney. The way that VEVRA is written, well, I'll talk about USERRA really quickly. USERRA is a law that seems to be working. The United Services and Employment and Reemployment Rights Act was passed in 1994, Title 38, Section 4301 and onward. It protects the civilian employment of active and reserve personnel when they are activated, and also clarifies existing law, improved enforcement mechanisms, and added federal employees as being eligible to receive protection under USERRA. And to this day, it's certainly not perfect, but there are several cases of USERRA actions that have benefited veterans. I see your hand is raised, Tim. Just one moment. I forgot to put in the amendments. Well, I wanted to make sure that I know USERRA exists. With GI Justice and MIA, I'm focusing on the laws that we need that are poorly written, don't exist, or aren't enforced. USERRA, I just want to put on the table, like I know it's there, but it doesn't protect veterans. I think it protects almost all service members if you have a contract. Tim, did you have a comment or a question?
Comment on USERRA and how it does not work. I had a friend of mine I served with, Mark Jeni. He was Staff Sergeant, Biomedical Equipment Repair Specialist. He and I got out about the same time. He went into the reserve unit in Ravenna, Ohio. There's a combat support hospital there as their biomedical equipment repair NCO. He was deployed Desert Shield, Desert Storm, spent best part of a year over there during the whole time. He had a civilian job as a biomedical equipment repair technician with a company that contracted with hospitals. He's in Ohio. That was where he lived. When he got back from his service time, they said, well, yeah, you can still work for us in Michigan. So he had to, because someone has your contract that you had before, so we will offer you a contract. So he had to move his family to Michigan for, I think it was about 5 years until they could move back to Ohio, where he and his wife were from. So it, again, it's, yes, they re-employed him, but not at his previous position and not at his previous, I believe they call it tier, but your
Hmm.
experience level pay
Interesting.
thing.
Yeah. Huh. And yeah, that's what it's supposed to protect people from is undue hardship related to your military service. A service member is actually a distinct legal entity in the United States because if you're a service member, if you have a contract or an MSO, you are subject to the GI, USM, good Lord, UCMJ first and foremost, and then everything else after. Vice versa, if someone brings an action against you in court, that's why the SCRA is there. It's going to have to wait until you're able to take care of the stuff. And this is Eric. It goes back to like the readiness factor. If you know that your employment's going to be changed because you're serving our country, that creates an undue hardship, and this is what it's supposed to protect against. So VEVRA, long name, is the Vietnam Era Veterans Rehabilitation and Assistance Act, initially passed in 1972. In 1972, it was called maybe just VERA, and I have a URL. I have a legislative history of VEVRA on GI Justice. I think it's under the blog. Yeah, it's under the blog, and I think that's the title: Legislative History of VEVRA. It was initially called VEVRA. VEVRA is the name in 1974 when they added affirmative action. You can see it. I've highlighted it here. So there's actually four parts of the law. You can see them here. The one I've excluded, I'll talk really briefly about in a moment, and that's about reporting. But essentially, the way the law is written, it leaves a lot of things out. And I haven't read this closely in some time, but I was about to mention this lawyer in California, Daniel Mendelson. He did he did some kind of counsel work for Disney in California. And he discovered, or he had suspected, that either they weren't doing their veterans preference hiring, or possibly, and I don't remember how he came across VEVRA, but like maybe they were in violation. And his experience of it is that, and he does contract law. The actual contract between Disney and the DoD, which is I don't know what it involves. I think it might be licensing Disney material to show overseas or something to that nature. All that the law requires is right here. That there is a clause in there that suggests the contractor will take affirmative action, and it goes on. You can file a complaint, and the Department of Labor will enforce the law, or is supposed to, even though it's Title 38, which is all Veterans Affairs stuff. This goes over to labor. So there's a weird overlap between DOL and VA at the federal level that always was confusing for like committees and committee staff members. But the only standard they create was prompt investigation. I'll get into how that's a problem in a moment. And then finally, I want to say in the 90s, yeah, I think it was in the 90s, Section C was added so that the number of complaints, the actions, and the resolutions would be tracked and reported to Congress. And so those three parts I'll talk about individually in a moment. But one of the parts that I excluded from here has to do with eligibility. So before we even get into what the law does or doesn't do, we're actually excluding some of the members of this community from this protection. So if you think employment discrimination, well, you can discriminate against some of this community, but not all of them. So in one of the subsections under paragraph A covered veteran, quote unquote, has to be disabled. They have to have a campaign badge or a service medal. and they have to have been separated within 3 years. Or I should say, or one of these 3/4. And there is certainly a time when you would get a service medal, but not a campaign medal. If you served during the global war on terror, but you didn't get deployed, you have a service medal, but not a campaign medal. But what that does is it creates unprotected veterans, vulnerable veterans, for whom it is fully legal to discriminate against them in their employment. That includes any peacetime veteran who does not have a disability. And it's hard to track the numbers because they overlap. But when I did some research in 2016, there were 4.5 million peacetime veterans in 2016. Now, the way it's worded, it just says has a disability, and it doesn't specify whether that qualification is under ADA or if, in fact, they have to be service connected through the Veterans Benefits and Health Administration. So it's vague. But that's somewhere between 15 and 20% of the veteran community. It's completely legal and lawful to discriminate against them in employment. It also protects employers. If you do not have a contract, or if your contract is less than $100,000 a year, you do not fall under the jurisdiction of VEVRA. Great example. Here in Oregon at Lynn Benton Community College last year, I put it in an application to be included in the adjunct pool at 2-year school. I've got 2 master's degrees. I'm overqualified, but I never got a call back. I sent several emails to department heads, never heard back. So I contacted the State Bureau of Labor and Industry, and they said, you should probably file a complaint. It sounds like they're in violation of the state level veterans preference stuff. Now, I also asked, because I always want to know what bases I can run, I tried to find out if, in fact, LBCC was a federal contractor. They weren't sure. I talked to HR, I can't remember their name. HR didn't know. They had to actually ask their counsel whether or not they're contractors. And I double checked. They are not federal contractors. I am not protected by VEVRA at LBCC. So that's an example. There's a database that lists all the federal contractors, how much money they get each year, their address, et cetera. And there's some contracts that are like $5,000 or $6,000, and they're big manufacturers. There's one like a cement company out here does a lot of business with the Department of State or something, or no, agriculture. That's a federal contract. But if it's less than 100,000, those employees at that cement factory would not be protected under VEVRA. So moving into the kind of meat and potatoes of the Act, VEVRA. As you saw in Section A, it talks about affirmative action. It really only requires some language in a contract, but what does affirmative action look like? It's coming under fire recently. The Supreme Court ruled against it in education. I think most Americans are opposed to affirmative action. My own understanding of it as, a norm core, cis het, white guy, is that affirmative action, and it came out of 1957 with Eisenhower and Kennedy. They talked about taking not just enforcing protecting steps, but actually affirmative action to attract, to recruit, retain, and promote marginalized communities in the interest of diversity, in the interest of economic prosperity, et cetera. In 57 and 1960, we created the EEOC. It was initially under Eisenhower, it's called something else. Kennedy finally got it in the Civil Rights Act of 1960. And this is where most affirmative action cases go, the Equal Employment and Opportunity Commission. It's been doing its thing for, I don't know how long, since probably 60. I think before it was the President's Committee on Civil Rights or something like that. But if you go to the EEOC's website and you look up what complaints, what laws, what classes and characteristics they protect, you'll notice it does not list veteran status or military status. EEOC is under no legal obligation to protect veterans. I've double checked this. I've triple checked this. They do not protect veterans. Housing and Urban Development, Fair Housing and Equal Opportunity Office also does not protect veterans unless it's positively ascribed in law. An institution and agency typically is not going to protect military and veteran status, including EEOC. That will come up again later when we talk about when some VEVRA cases do get enforced and how that's creating a problem. Affirmative action is also about creating diversity through not incentives, and I don't even know if it's really enforcement. What the hope is that populations within a workplace represent the relative population outside the workplace. And that's not always the same as population. If anybody knows VEVRA, you'll know that the Department of Labor establishes what they call a benchmark, a hiring benchmark. Now, in 2020, in Oregon, 6.1% of veterans, or 6.1% of Oregonians are veteran, which you can see under column D. And this spreadsheet is something I recreated based off of this. I don't know if you can see my screen or my face, but the OSU Equal Opportunity and Access Office, they've provided this fun little table because part of VEVRA requires employers to track who they hire into what tier of employment, how many are retained, how many are new hires. So the data is there, and the data is sometimes scary and gross. So for example, in Oregon, 6.1% of residents are veteran. The hiring benchmark is actually 5.7% because it's set at the national level. Now, I drilled into these numbers based off of their own reporting, and I have the last column just is too wide, but all the totals. So I took the total number of veterans in the academic tier, in the professional tier, and in the classified tier. And I figured out what percentage of the total academic, professional, and classified employees were veterans. And you'll see here, academic faculty at OSU, there's 1%. There's 23 veterans, and there's something like 6,000 total employees. I should bring it back up, or I can pull it up. At the mid tier, so there's 2,300 academic faculty at OSU. 23 of them are veterans. That's 1%. They're below the hiring benchmark. There are fewer veterans employed at OSU than are qualified probably in the workplace. In the mid tier, it bumps up to 3.4% representation. There's 86 veterans in the mid tier for about 2,500 total employees. And then finally, at the very bottom, where you get like maintenance, clerical, administrative stuff, a lot of it is entry level. All of a sudden, you see we have 3.6% of that tier is made up of veterans. So if I've talked to OSU like I want to work there. I had a career in academia before I became a father and after I filed some federal investigations. But looking at these numbers, it's an uphill battle for me to be recognized for my qualifications and be placed accordingly. Part of that is because I haven't gotten a PhD, but they have plenty of instructors who teach undergrads, who assist, full professors, but there's only 1% of representation there. At the bottom, just because I was curious, I looked at how many total employees across tiers and what that percentage of is in their 6,300 employees. So 2.6 of the entire workforce is a veteran. That means we're less than half utilized. There should be something like 320, right? There's 164. That is only better than the representation for people with disabilities. Above that, we have Hispanic representation. They're less than half as well. And then overrepresented, we have Native American and Alaskan Indians, which makes sense. It's the Pacific Northwest. And the other big one is people who are identifying as Asian. So I'm not trying to compare different communities. I want to know what their affirmative action plan has accomplished. And for me, it's not accomplishing much. It's loading us at the bottom. Um, and so data like this helps us understand that there might be a problem, but it doesn't always get us to what the problem is or how to correct it, how to get more veterans on campus. And because that's local, I wanted to kind of throw that out there as an example. The next section I wanted to talk about is promptly investigates. This is the only standard that is measurable. And I say that because Vevra has been taken to court a handful of times. The highest one was Greer v. Chow. It made it to the Eighth Circuit. Whoopsies. Let me see if I can go back. I skipped too far ahead. Um, the the law has been challenged, or its enforcement has been challenged a number of times, most notably by Donald Greer in 2007. And I read his stuff. He filed a couple of other complaints. He doesn't strike me as the most reliable narrator, just like like Jeffrey Sarver and Blaster One. Anyway, he's not the greatest guy, but like that doesn't make it okay to write bad laws to expose veterans to discrimination. In 2007, Greer takes the Secretary of Labor to court saying, look, they didn't investigate. And Sandra Day O'Connor, quoting another Vevra case by a judge, I can't remember the first name, but Kennedy, she quoted another case in order to say the investigation, like the final decision to enforce, is within the agency's discretion. And she went on, this other judge that she's quoting also said, it makes Vevra no law at all because promptly investigates is not a meaningful standard. Their own compliance manual at DOL calls for resolution within 180 days. My Vevra complaint took about 250. The average, when I went and FOIA'd the last 20 years of data, the average was well over a year and a half. And I mean, they could say it's prompt if they don't have enough staff, they don't have enough money, that's as prompt as they can go, right? It's not meaningful standard. And so because there's no standard, and it wasn't written with the same kind of attention to detail, I guess, as other laws like the Civil Rights Act of 1964, we get short shrift, right? But this is this is the highest case I could find. Donald Greer v. Chow, Secretary of Labor in 2007. But I mean, it basically means, and I included her quote because it made me think if the Justice Department, say, decided that they didn't want to act on racial hatred and bias in employment, under this rationale, the DOJ could just decide it's entirely within their realm of discretion to only enforce hate crimes against white people or something. I don't know. I was really struck that a former Supreme Court justice has said they can do whatever they want. They can piss in a bucket and call it lemonade because that's what they can do. And as we'll see in a moment, that is kind of what's going on. Finally, this complaints paragraph. It just says you can complain and a Secretary of Labor has to investigate. And then it talks about, some of the definitions and stuff. So I looked up, I started, I'm a stay-at-home dad. I got plenty of time, a lot of stuff I can do on my phone. And so a couple of years ago, I looked up how many complaints were being processed by DOL. And remember, I saw that the law is clear. Number, actions, and resolution, right? Three things. And what I first saw in 2018 was just that, what you see on the screen. One line containing the number of complaints, 132. I was like, okay, well, that doesn't seem right. There at least needs to be some more information. I checked 2019. That is the only line they had in 2019, this annual report, 179 complaints. Now, one thing to know is that the enforcement agency is not the reporting agency. Underneath DOL are two agencies. One, the enforcement agency, is the Office of Federal Contracts and Compliance Program. They enforce, or I'll use the scare quotes, enforce. Vets, Veterans Employment and Training Services, they do the report. And vets and OFCCP don't always talk. And when I FOIA'd OFCCP. And DOL even has a page on their own website of the enforcement data that does not match any of this. And I'll show it. I'll show it in a second. And I'm laughing because I don't want to cry or throw my computer across the room. 2019, I was like, wait a minute. You guys got to get your shit together. I talked to a guy named Robert Shepard. And then I talked with his boss, Torrens, something Torrens. And I think Torrens is still there. And I let him have it. I brought the receipts. I showed them the PDF on their own website. I showed them the law. I linked it to .gov, whatever. And they tried to gaslight me. They tried to ignore me. And then I went to Mike Levin, who at the time was on the subcommittee, or he was on HVAC. And I was in his district when I was living in California the year before last. And I made a big stink. And 2020, don't you know, all of a sudden they magically published this table. And it has all these complaint outcomes. This is the first time it appeared, maybe since the reporting requirement was written into law. I don't know. And it has here a total of 194 complaints. And so it's gone up. But when you start looking at their own information, it leaves a lot of questions. So in 2020, most of their complaints, 40% of them were either closed without stating why, or they were referred to the EEOC, which we all know does not protect veterans. So 80% of their own complaints, they're saying, we brushed them off to another agency, or we're not going to tell you why we closed them. That feels suspicious to me. So I kept pressing them. In 2021, nothing appeared. I don't know why. It was just crickets. There was no line. There was no table. There was nothing. And that's when I kind of upped the pressure on Levin. And Bobby Scott, I think, was the DOL, or he was the Labor Committee chairman at the time, and he was a veteran. Still, I never heard back from his office. 2021, there was nothing. 2022, they have this table. And now the number's gone down to 110 complaints. That's how many they closed. And of those, they referred, again, 40% to the EEOC, which is an agency that does not protect veterans. 42 of them, they said it wasn't their jurisdiction. And then 2 of them, they provided a right to sue, which is essentially, we're not going to help you, but you can sue them if you do it within, I think it's 90 days, or I don't know, there's some limit. But they, according to this, they did not have a single finding of merit in 2022. There was not a single complaint from a veteran that was legitimate in their eyes. Fast forward to 2023, the most recent one. I just saw this stuff last night because I had to get the screenshots. They received 400 complaints. That's an increase of almost 400%. And then I guess they received 414, but they only investigated 20, I think. They closed with no violations, the vast majority of them. 2 of them, they found violations in 2023. And that, again, statistically, that is statistically significant. That's saying 80% of the veterans that the claims that they investigated based on a veteran's complaint were without merit. They're all just a bunch of malingerers, profile queens, broke dicks. I don't really believe that, but I'm not sure what those numbers say other than we don't believe veterans. Yeah, go ahead, Eric.
Is there any way to find out those 2 that were verified what they were for, and the other ones? Is it possible to get that kind of data? Like, what did they say wasn't, or what did they say was?
The FOIA is the most reliable. I'm going to try and open. So I didn't include I'm a little crazy. I FOIA'd 20 years of data and sorted it into, vets, not vets. Let me see if I can find it. Yeah, here it is. Let me see if I'm sharing this. No, no, no. Stop sharing. Okay, share another thingy. Is that it? Yeah, I think that's it. Okay, so y'all seeing a Google sheet?
Yep.
So this is 1,600 cases between 2000 and 2020. Actually, yeah, this is it. So I FOIA'd it. And none of the numbers that I've just quoted to you that are being reported to Congress, I could not match any of them up. Because each year there was, yeah, I even had some charts. And Eric, I can share this with you if you want. It's been a while since I've really refined it, but like data's just data. But the stories that data tell us is important. So one of the charts that I'll show you again here in this 20-year that's different. I've updated these guys here. From 2000 to 2020, OFCCP, DOL's enforcement agency, received more complaints from veterans than any other complainant that they protect. In that same time, veterans and VEVRA received the fewest findings of merit. So we are the largest group of complainants to the DOL, and the DOL is coming back to us saying disproportionately, we don't believe you. That, I don't know, you're making this up, or maybe they're smart and they say, and they look into it and they're like, look, there's no law that has been violated. VEVRA is not that kind of law. And there's nothing we can do because, what are we going to do? Tell them that they did something wrong when there's nothing in law? So to your question, Eric, yes, there's a way I can FOIA this stuff, or I can look up on the data enforcement data page to see in 2023 how many VEVRA complaints there were. Of those, how many were by veterans? Because it doesn't always overlap for some reason. And then it will have the respondent's name, the person, the defendant, essentially. So we can get that data. It wouldn't be much time, and that's one of my like pet projects was to look that stuff up and try and kind of report it out as though I were a little journalist or something. I'm not. I don't have any training, but like I know how stories work, and I know how to ask people what's going on. But here's the updated data with a link to the actual FOIA data set. They've anytime they get FOIAs, they store it, and I imagine mine is one of them. But this is what my data that I got from FOIA suggests. And everything they're reporting to Congress is convoluted and unverifiable, at least as far as I can tell. And so that kind of leaves us in this position of like, it's a crappy law. An agency is not even enforcing the crappy law. And it's something that one of the things that is troubling is that I found some reports that suggest peacetime non-disabled veterans are at greater risk of unemployment, and yet they're excluded from employment discrimination protections. So at the very top, we have to rewrite VEVRA. We have to start from the bottom or the from scratch and create clear enforcement standards, remove eligibility requirements, just like removing the sunsetting of hate crimes after, 5 years after discharge or separation. The Labor Department needs to abide by the 14th Amendment and provide equal protection. They need to do a better job of investigating, and then also track and report that data accurately to Congress and make it a matter of public concern. I've asked repeatedly, Levin and Trone. Trone was on labor for a while. Look, have a hearing, get it on C-SPAN, so at least it forces the conversation to the fore. But I couldn't succeed because it always happened that the person I was in touch with, their party was losing power, something. And then finally, state and local, they frequently have their own, like Oregon has, from all I can tell, a decent veterans preference, but it's not being enforced. I mean, LBCC, the example I used earlier, um, they wouldn't give me just a verbal affirmation that they followed the process because I could prove to them that they were being honest or not. If they made any hires in the entire year that my application was active, they would have been required to interview me. If they made a single hire of an adjunct faculty, they would have been in violation, because anytime you hire, you're supposed to also at least interview a veteran under Oregon state law. And so typically state enforcement measures and state protections are better. It doesn't mean they're more enforced or more well known, but I think that those are the kind of challenges that we face in our next steps. That went longer than I thought. I apologize. We have about 10 minutes for Q&A and discussion. And as before, I'm happy to put this on YouTube separately from my own little thing. But Tim and Nick and Eric, if you have anything, thoughts, questions, concerns, I'm happy to host a conversation about it.